Thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to talk about the evolution of open source projects and Theia, the Eclipse Theia framework in particular. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark. I'm a software engineer with TypeFox, and I'm mainly working on open source software. We had talks about Langium today and yesterday as well. I'm the dev lead behind Langium, but today I'm going to talk about Theia, where I'm contributing regularly as well. And so we're going to look at software evolution from a project perspective. So how did Theia start, or how do projects in general start? What requirements do we have for starting a project? And how did members and contributors change over the last 5 years? And we're also going to take a technical look at this. So we're going to take a look at the textbook definition of software evolution. We're going to take a look at complexity in relation to software evolution, especially over time, and some metrics which are related to this. And so first off, what are the requirements for starting a project? So projects generally arise from some sort of business need. And Theia, being a general purpose web and desktop IDE, makes it very clear for what you would use it for. So in case you need a web and desktop IDE. And Theia in particular, for those who are not familiar with it, features high extensibility built in. And with that comes customizations, branding, and so on. And by now, Theia is quite popular with more than 17,000 stars on GitHub and more than 2,000 forks. And in case you haven't heard about Theia yet, there have been other talks about Theia this year as well, 6 in total. One of them, another one is still coming up, how to run Theia in the cloud in just 45 minutes. And with that out of the way, let's talk about why TypeFox started Theia in the first place. So in 2016 and 2017, it was already quite clear that the development tooling landscape was moving towards the JavaScript stack, with the foremost example being Visual Studio Code, but others such as Atom and Sublime, written on the JavaScript stack as well, being ever more popular. We had a lot of customers which came to us with web IDE requirements as well, and so we tried to satisfy those in customer projects, but well, although it worked out, it was always related with, a ton of work, and we had to customize a lot of stuff. We started building based on, for example, like Jupyter Lab. But anyway, we needed something that was more flexible, something which was more customizable. And so we left the Java stack, which we were previously more familiar with Eclipse Xtext and the Eclipse RCP platform, for a new framework, which would eventually become Eclipse Theia. And with this in mind, of course, we were able to replace Eclipse RCP with our customers. And especially we're able to actually acquire new customers, with the foremost example being the Arduino IDE, which we helped design and develop during the last few years. And the Arduino IDE was released just, I think, 1 or 2 months ago. So check it out if you like. It's quite cool. But we not only used Theia for our own, for our own customers, but for ourselves as well. So in 2017 as well, TypeFox started a new product called Gitpod. This is an image of Gitpod in 2018. It still looks like the new Theia DNA, but you can see an older image of Theia basically used as a front end for a whole workspace management platform, which was Gitpod. And so note that Gitpod split itself off in 2020 to basically become their own company, and which left TypeFox being a pure consulting business again. And of course, aside from aside from just Gitpod and Arduino, there are tons of other Theia-based applications as well, most of which we didn't develop, but some of which we did. And this is just a selection which is available on the Theia IDE website. But I'm sure there are lots of other more products out there based on Theia. Lots of internal tooling as well. We've heard Ericsson, Paul talk about their experiences using Theia, which they're using as an internal tooling. And so there's a lot of it out there. And so coming to this abstract piece of art, which is supposed to represent how the major contributors to Theia evolved over time. So basically, this is just percentage-based. You can't read any absolute values out there. And so the main contributors to Theia during the last 5 years have been TypeFox, Ericsson, Red Hat, ARM, SAP, and Eclipse Source. And this annotated version explains a bit better why some members joined and some have dropped off. And so at the start, there was TypeFox and Ericsson, which band together to create an IDE platform, which they both wanted to use. And later on, as development went on, TypeFox created the Gitpod product in late 2017. And then shortly after, already, Red Hat joined the project in order to start supporting VS Code extensions in Theia, together with TypeFox, which are also very interested in that. And this went on for quite a while, until in late 2021, Gitpod, which was already its own company by this point, decided to switch to VS Code, which was quite, well, although bad for the project, you could say. What Gitpod actually required was just a stock standard web IDE, and so given that Theia is supposed to be very extensible and brandable and so on, it wasn't really suitable for their use case. And so they opted to use the web version of VS Code instead, which was becoming web compatible around this point in time. And later on, in 2021, I joined the project, which was the spike from TypeFox at this point in time. And to this day, I'm still contributing to Theia, not only in code, but especially in pull request reviews. So my contribution has dropped off a bit, but I'm still very much involved in the project. Around this time as well, Red Hat also kind of removed their contribution to the project. They're still offering Theia as part of their code-ready workspaces product, but I believe they've mostly migrated to VS Code and the JetBrains platform. Right, and with the project management stuff done, we're going to talk about software evolution and the more technical aspects of how projects evolve. So first off, the term software evolution basically describes that over time, if you have a product, you will know that new user requirements will emerge eventually. Users also will definitely find bugs somewhere in your application. Similarly, during all that time, dependencies will become outdated, insecure, and will need to be replaced or exchanged for a new version at least as well. And so in total, software evolution basically says that once you have a successful software or product, you will need to maintain it for it to maintain its successful standing. And looking at it, software evolution is split into two parts. So the first part is adaption, where we look at new features, we look at bug fixes, we look at improvements to existing features. And the other part is migration, where we try to basically look at how we change platforms, for example, like switching databases, migrating data, migrating from an existing dependency to a new one, or updating dependencies just in general. And both adaption and migration generally lead to more code being written in the platform, and also generally to more complexity. And complexity makes the application or the software less maintainable with time. And unless we aim to tame complexity, our software will eventually become unmaintainable. However, before we go too deep into the topic of complexity, let's look at the adaption in the Theia framework first. So Theia features a monthly update cycle, similarly to Visual Studio Code, for example. For each month, we have roughly 50 merge pull requests in the main repository. We also have a few other pull repositories like the website and the UML generator. I'm not looking into that because, well, my analysis tool wasn't quite sophisticated enough. But during each month, we have on average 8 breaking changes, which are introduced due to pull requests. But note that although these are documented breaking changes, and I'm sure we have a few more undocumented each month as well, given that Theia features an extensive DI mechanism, every part of Theia is somehow API, and so every little change, even in protected small methods, which are pretty sure not used by any customer, we still have to document it, since it's in theory a breaking change. And in this blocks plot here, you can also see how much we actually change with each pull request. And actually more than 50% of pull requests are relatively small, being less than 50 lines of code, of insertions or deletions. Actually, the median pull request is somewhere around 15 to 20 lines of code. It's relatively small. However, the average lines of code changed, as in additions, is actually way more at 130 lines of code. And this is quite easily explainable when looking at a special contributor of ours, Colin from Ericsson, who has recently committed quite a lot. And so his average pull request, for example, pulls up the average by a ton. Right, and looking at those 50 pull requests more in depth, we can see that most of them are actually concerned with features. So 2/3 of them are either new features or improvements to existing features. We also have bug fixes, which were usually introduced during the last release cycle, with roughly a fourth of all pull requests each month. And then the rest of it is split among documentation and infrastructure, such as OCI build and so on. Next up is migration. So in Theia, after each release cycle, we also have a monthly dependency and update cycle. So in order to secure our secure supply chain, we regularly update our dependencies in order to pull new versions with fixed CVs, for example. And this also includes somewhat irregular platform updates. So we try to move on newer Node LTS versions, for example, and drop old ones as well. So for example, we've recently moved on to Node 16 and dropped Node 12. And what we also do is, for example, a React update. The React update from React 16 to 18, for example, was quite a hassle, involving a few old dependencies which just didn't work with React 18 anymore, which were needed to be replaced. So that was a ton of work as well. Then we also have seldom layout data migrations. So in theory, when you start Theia, for example, and open a few tabs, editors, whatever, and close Theia again and open it the next time, Theia will actually open up all tabs that you have previously opened. And it stores all of that data inside of the local storage. And given that it's just plain JSON data and the application changes over time, this data needs to be migrated in any way in order not to introduce, broken data inside of our local storage. However, this is, like I said, done quite seldomly. We have broken our data format so far during the last 5 years 4 times. So we do this like once a year at most. And you could also argue that the VS Code API update process is a part of the migration as well, given that we aim to always support, well, at least a new point of the, or relatively recent point of the VS Code extension API, but it is always moving forward, so we always have to migrate to that as well. However, you could also say it's like kind of part of an adaption process, so it's kind of both. So now that we've done, or we're done talking about adaption and migration, let's talk about complexity. And the first thing that comes to mind when talking about complexity is, of course, how do we measure complexity at all? And so there are quite a few metrics which we could use in theory. So for example, Halstead metrics measure the amount of operations that we have in our code and the operators used. This was introduced quite early, like in the 70s, and back then it was mostly procedural code. We don't do that anymore, and this metric has become quite useless in modern code bases. We also have something like cyclometric complexity and also code shape, which both kind of measure the amount of nesting going on in a given method or function. And this is quite local. So this is quite localized to a function, to a method. We can't really apply this to a given architecture. And so this is also kind of out of the question as well. And then we also have the simple lines of code metric. But, well, we're a framework. We do have lots of code. I mean, we do have 2,000 lines of code or something. It's not too much, but generally, reducing code is quite good, but having more code is sometimes required simply due to having more features or something similar. And so this isn't the best metric for measuring complexity in this case. So what I've picked out instead was glue, the dark matter of software. This is a quote by Marcel Weyer, some CEO in a Berlin IT company. He was previously a software engineer at Wunderlist, which was acquired by Microsoft somewhere in 2015. And he made a blog post last year talking about glue code. So, which binds our pieces of software in our code bases together. Something like, well, binding like business logic to UI and persistence and messaging in our application. It doesn't really do anything, but it has to be in there or else our application won't run. And similar to dark matter in real life, glue code fills a ton of space in our applications. So Marcel in his blog post said it fills 95% of the more than 300,000 lines of code in the Wunderlist application. And he says unless glue code is well managed, it tends to grow quadratically. Because for every feature that you have, or add, that you need to somehow bind it together with all existing features that you have on all of your UI and all of your persistence. And so every new feature adds more and more glue code, meaning it grows quadratically over time. So let's take a look how we could measure glue code in Theia. So there wasn't really like any advice on how to do this in this blog post. So I just took the first thing which came to my mind. I've talked about how Theia makes heavy use of dependency injection. So what I did here was simply starting to plot, starting from the first release up to the latest, the amount of services and implementations that we have, our injectable services, in relation to our injections, which in this case represent our glue code. And it isn't quite clear here, but in this next slide, you can actually see the coefficient between implementations and glue. And although it's a bit wonky at the start, for the last 2 years, the coefficient between those two has been quite stable. And unlike what Marcel said, it doesn't grow quadratically. It doesn't even grow linearly. It's quite stable instead. And so, what does this say about Theia? So, what is the conclusion we can take out of this metric at all? So, as Jonas and Paul earlier said and talks about Theia is that Theia is split into different packages. I believe more than 40 by now. And each package in itself deals with one feature usually, except for the core package, which well contains the core functionality of Theia, so it's a bit more. But usually, like the editor feature package concerns itself with editors, messaging features concerns itself. The messaging package concerns itself with messaging, and so on and so forth. In itself, each package, then again, is kind of well modularized. Usually, when you add a feature, or a service implementation, it is usually used by one or two services. And so the level of glue that we have, the level of injections, stays relatively stable. And another thing which is very important in here is that we do have lots of abstraction layers. So for example, we do use a lot of JSON RPC to communicate between the front and back end. We do a lot of protocol work and so on in order to reduce the amount of glue code that we need. For example, we use React in order not to write, well, our custom UI layout stuff using HTML5 and so on. So this in general allows us to reduce our glue code by quite a lot. And I came through this quite a lot quicker than I actually expected. So I'm already arriving at the conclusion. So in this short talk, you see now actually how open source projects can start out of business needs. You've also seen how contributors and why contributors join and leave projects. And we talked about the technical aspects behind the evolution of software over time. So yeah, that brings us to the final end. Thank you everyone for attending and listening. Are there any questions? Sebastian, please.
Thank you for the talk. Do you also have absolute numbers for the contributions or maybe relative numbers available?
So the question was about absolute and relative numbers of contributions that we had in Theia. I had absolute numbers as well, yes. I've decided not to publish them because actually Jonas earlier, like yesterday I believe, had a talk about how contribution over the past years as a number of commits and additions and so on has been quite stable. Yes, I do have those numbers, but I don't have them on my laptop actually, so I can't show them even though I would like to. But I do have them actually, never mind. They are hidden inside of the PowerPoint. Right. So maybe I can scroll down a bit. I don't. Okay, doesn't matter. Oh, yes, indeed. So, right. Yeah, that's the data actually. For each quarter. I also have a list with each month actually, but the data is quite difficult to read in that case. So I've just got that. I'll leave that open for you. Yeah, that's the number of change lines, exactly. Yeah. So I thought that would make the most sense in that regard. All right. Other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, with the companies dropping out of those projects, would you say that it's good for open source projects to have like diverse companies committing, or would you say that one strong company is fair enough?
So the question was whether having multiple contributing companies in one project was better than just having one who's just putting in a ton of work. I would generally tend to agree to the first statement. So multiple contributors is always better because usually multiple contributors always contribute more than just one. And you also have just the advantage that, well, features aren't just dominated by one company, which is just looking into their own needs and demands. Paul, who gave the previous talk about Theia, probably would disagree with you, with this idea. He would say that just having Ericsson in there is good enough, but yeah, I believe that the current way we are dealing with Theia and its development with three companies, which are actually a bit more, so both Eclipse and TypeFox are kind of a proxy of some sorts, because we are both consulting companies, so we're doing a lot of sponsored development on Theia, so there are actually a bit more contributing companies in there as rather than just the three that are currently at the end of this graph. All right, any more questions? Also, one additional thing, just in general regarding the state of Theia and companies dropping out, I believe that, well, back then, Theia was basically the only really option, like the only real option for developers to actually build their own web IDEs. But now the field has become way more diverse, at least with just Theia and VS Code, which has already doubled the space. And in this regard, if you just need a stock standard IDE, and that's what we also tell our customers, you would probably just go with VS Code. It's more mature, but on the other hand, if you need like a lot of adaptations in your IDE, if you need custom tooling in there, which you can't accomplish using VS Code, if you want it heavily branded and so on, you should probably still go with Theia, and a lot of people do. All right, that ends this. Thanks, everyone.